watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Today we are at the Stock Exchange with an absolutely spectacular day put together by the AIFL and the American-Israel Chamber of Commerce. And the reality is that Israel's position in terms of country delegation size, that is, companies that are traded on the various exchanges in New York, has precipitously dropped. We've dropped from number 2, of course, if you read the book, it says number 2, to number 3. We've been overtaken, would you believe, by China. So today, the ranking in the world in terms of numbers of companies traded on Wall Street is the United States, China, and Israel. That kind of competition and overtaking I can handle. Number 2, we are locked in a mortal combat for the second place in terms of startup production. How do you measure startup production? The number of companies that are getting venture capital funding. Israel this year, we have with us Hemi Peres, one of Israel's most distinguished venture capitalists, the son of Shimon, our president. And he knows that this year in Israel, we will have 600 companies getting venture capital funding, if they're lucky, from Patango and from other very good funds. But we're locked in combat with another player in the world who this year will actually have 700 companies getting venture capital funding. And that player is called Europe. That player is not Germany or France or the UK or Italy. It's the entire continent of Europe, from Moscow to Oslo, down to the boot of Italy and to the Atlantic. The only difference between these two combatants who are trying to get into number 2 spot behind Silicon Valley is that Europe has about 700 million people, and we have a little over 7. So it's not too bad that we're at 600 startups getting venture capital funding when all of Europe is producing 700. To show you what's going on in Europe, my good friend Daniel Taub, now Ambassador Daniel Taub, presented his credentials just 2 weeks ago to the Queen of England. And if you've seen these pictures online, they're quite remarkable. And the first question that the Queen asked Ambassador Taub, Israel's new ambassador to the UK, to the Court of St. James, was, "Mr. Ambassador, I'm intrigued. Can you tell me more about Israel's impressive high-tech sector?" The Queen of England. That's the first thing that she asked Israel's ambassador. "Tell me about your high tech." And this is by and large a result, in my opinion, of the work that Dan and Saul have done with that book, Startup Nation. That book has changed and rocked our world. The world before Startup Nation is not like the world afterwards. It has literally given a new life to our brand of Israel. In fact, for many years, people would often come to me and say, how come we don't have in this generation a Leon Uris who can capture the essence of Israel in a new book, a new Exodus? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that new book, that new Exodus is Startup Nation. And that's what we're here to celebrate tonight. So, without any further ado, I'm going to ask Dan, to what extent do you think the Startup Nation phenomena is potentially going to be over soon? In other words, a lot of people say, look, Israel's been lucky. There's been a perfect storm. Israel's built all these startups, but here come the Chinese, here come the Indians. Israel can't continue this kind of entrepreneurial explosion. Is the party going to be over soon, or are we just getting started?
It's a very Jewish way to open up the evening. It's great that it's been going well, but, it's just funny, apropos of that, our book, as John referred to, was favorably reviewed around the world, which we were pleasantly surprised by. It was favorably reviewed in like 17, 18 countries, except for one, Israel. Haaretz, their chief criticism of our book was it was too pro-Israel. So I just want to take a minute before I answer your question to acknowledge John Medved and Chemi Peres, who really have been living and breathing the Startup Nation story long before Saul and I tuned into it. They were telling the story around the planet. Literally, John schlepping around the world with this PowerPoint presentation, telling anyone the story that would be prepared to listen to it, whether it was 5 people or 500 people. Chemi, literally back to the Yozma program, the cutting edge of some of the most amazing and innovative startups coming out of Israel. And we just told the story. These guys have actually been doing it and living it and breathing it, and I just want to give a round of applause to them. Ambassador Dan Gillerman also has a role in this story. In 1985, he was part of what was called the Peres Troika. The Peres Troika was Peres at the time. Shimon Peres was prime minister. The Troika was government, labor, and business. They were trying to combat hyperinflation in Israel. And Ambassador Gillerman was part of the team that led the negotiations for business, that cut a deal that ultimately put Israel on a path to combating hyperinflation. And as ambassador to the UN, many of you remember during those tough days, during the 2006 Lebanon War, in the summer of 2006, Dan Gillerman was in the UN day in, day out, making one of the most powerful and compelling cases in defense of Israel. And it's an honor to be on the stage with you tonight. Mayor Ed Koch is one of the most principled voices on issues of foreign policy in the Democratic Party. Harry Truman, Scoop Jackson, Joe Lieberman, and Ed Koch would be my kind of Democratic Party.
Thank you.
If Mr. Obama's reelected, we only hope you can be a Secretary of State. To answer your question, John, look, 2 things. One, if you look at all of the foreign direct investment coming into Israel today, 80% of it comes from the United States. Overwhelming majority comes from the United States. What does that mean? That means that the U.S. economy, not the intelligentsia, not necessarily the media, but economic and business leaders, have basically figured out the indispensable nation of Israel's role in the global economy and the startup nation. But there's this huge growth potential. Less than 20% is comprised from Asia and from Europe and elsewhere. And what's most exciting, if you leave Europe out and we can return to that, what's most exciting is in places like parts of the world like Asia, and even surprisingly parts of the Middle East, there's no inhibition about investing in Israel, doing business with Israelis, in parts of Africa. It's quite remarkable how much interest there's been in the story. So I think the story is just beginning. It's been a U.S.-Israel-centric story, but it's going to broaden. Saul, my co-author, right now is on a flight from Tel Aviv to Brussels. He's doing a briefing for the European Parliament, for the EU, on the Israeli innovation. They needed some advice these days, as you may have followed, on how they kind of are supposed to get their mojo back. Anyways, from Brussels, Saul's flying to Nairobi. The reason he's flying to Nairobi is because the president of Kenya has put together a team to advise him on how to jumpstart the Kenyan economy. And one of the people he wanted was a economic thinker on Israel's innovation story. And so he goes from Brussels to Kenya. Long story short, I can go on anecdotally. There's a lot of interest and a lot of partnering to do. But I think the most exciting part, separate from the economic opportunity, is, this is an overused term, but I'll use it anyways, the messaging and the narrative opportunity. We have been surprised, pleasantly surprised, by the extent to which our book and the broader story has touched people and communities that have never thought about Israel, have not interacted with Israel. 2 quick examples. Startup Nation is, again, to our surprise, a big hit in the U.S. military veterans community. Right? It's now almost a must-read, we understand, at West Point. Tom Brokaw, who's the chronicler, as you know, of the greatest generation, was giving a commencement speech at Annapolis at the Naval Academy, talked about Startup Nation. At the end of the speech, people were coming up to him. Parents were familiar with the book. We're invited to speak at military bases in the United States, throughout the southern United States. So many Americans, vets, are pointing out that over the next few years, we will be reintegrating into our economy tens of thousands of people who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And many of them have suffered tragic experiences, and they should get the attention that they do. However, many of them have also developed some amazing leadership skills and developed some amazing improvisational and interdisciplinary skills. And they are great managers, and they've gotten these crucible leadership experiences in the battlefield. And our economy and our civilian part of our society doesn't know what to do with them. And you know, we tell a story in the book about this young vet who fought in Fallujah, junior officer who fought in Iraq, comes back from Iraq, developed went over to fight, commanded troops in battle, but while he was there, he was told he had to do tribal negotiations, he had to set up sewage facilities, he had to reopen schools. He was put in charge of things that never in a million years he was trained to do and wasn't told he would be doing. Had to learn this stuff on the fly and lead people on the fly. He comes back from Iraq. He's applying for a job at a major tech company in Silicon Valley, whose name I won't mention, but all of you would be familiar with. And during the interview, he's describing all these amazing experiences he developed in the battlefield. At the end of the interview, the corporate recruiter said, "Well, that's all very interesting, but have you ever had a real job?" Now, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic, and if I can tell you, I have heard this story over and over and over again. And what these vets are telling us is every single Israeli is literate about a military resume, right? You're a young Israeli, you're applying for a job at a tech company in Israel, or you're raising capital in an Israeli VC fund. The first question they ask you, as John Medved pointed out to me years ago, is not what did you major in, it's not what university you went to. The first question they ask you is what unit did you serve in the military? And so these vets are so curious about how to better educate the American business community about the incredible talent in the United States that will be coming back from the battlefield from these two theaters of war over the next few years.
Amen to that. Ambassador Gillerman, Dan made reference to this story and its role around the world. I think that certainly in discussions with Ken, many people think that Israel is hated in the world. In other words, that the job that you had at the UN is no picnic. That basically, in Hebrew we say, sonim otanu, you know, they just don't like us. Is that true? Do you think that the world really doesn't like us? And number one. And number two, to what extent do you think this story of Startup Nation can actually be used as a weapon in terms of public opinion and diplomacy in terms of Israel and the nations?
Well, first, let me say how honored I am to be flanked on this stage by Israel's greatest friend and Israel's greatest advocate. Yeah. This in itself is an incredible honor. I also warn you that you're probably going to hear more than one opinion tonight. But that's a piece of cake in this city where I understand hospitals have signs that say Jewish patients should bring their second opinion first. So I'll try and answer John's question in a very personal way. I was never a diplomat. I was never in government. I was never in the Foreign Service. I was a business person in Israel, and I was chairman of the Israeli Chamber of Commerce. I was leading many economic delegations abroad. I was accompanying many of our leaders on state visits, and I kept saying that Israeli business persons should do more for the country than just worry about the bottom line and their shareholders. And at one point, what to me was probably, one of the incredible duos of Israeli history and politics, Shimon Peres, who to my mind is one of the world's greatest leaders today, and who was then foreign minister, and Arik Sharon was prime minister, came to me and said, "Danny, you've been preaching it all your life, now we want you to go and do it." And when I accepted, many of my friends thought I was crazy. because they wondered why a sane person would leave a comfortable life and go to that lion's den. Maybe because my name was Daniel, they thought I was appropriate, but to that lion's den on First Avenue, where I would be hated and persecuted and isolated. Hated was one of the words they used, which you used. And what I can tell you tonight, and I've said it before, is that each and every day, when I walked the halls of the UN, I walked with my head held up high, because I knew I was representing a country that was far, far better than most other member states of the United Nations. A country that makes deserts bloom with its agriculture, that makes limbs literally move with its medicine, that makes the world a better place each and every day with its science and technology and research and innovation and creativity, and indeed makes the world a richer place each and every day with its art and with its culture. A country that contributes to mankind, not just to itself and to the Jewish people, but to mankind and to the world, more than most other nations in the world, and certainly more than many members of the United Nations. Now, the problem, as John pointed out, is how do you change the narrative? How do you change the narrative and the perception of Israel from a country that is perceived as a place of war and terror and bloodshed to a place of innovation and excellence and beauty? Now, there's one very simple way, and that is to bring everybody to Israel. If we could bring every single person in this world to Israel, the perception would change overnight. In fact, one of the things I tried to do was to bring as many of my colleagues at the UN, and apart from Israel, most countries send their best people to the UN. I'm joking, Israel does too, and the present ambassador to the UN is a terrific guy who will do a tremendous job, Ron Prosor, who was here earlier. I'm very proud of him, and he will do an incredible job. But seriously, most countries send very senior people. Some of them were foreign ministers, others, during my term, 14 of my colleagues became foreign ministers, including Sergei Lavrov of Russia and Ahmed Abulgate of Egypt and many, many others. And we made sure many of them came to Israel, because there is no substitute to actually coming and seeing and touching and smelling and feeling that incredible country. That, by the way, is one of the greatest things the America-Israel Friendship League does. Those missions to Israel that consists mainly of people who have never been to Israel, to whom Israel is an enigma, whose perception of Israel is based on what they see on cable news networks. And when they come, they are transformed, and they come back, and they become our best ambassadors. Now, why, in spite of all that, is there this perception of Israel being hated? The first and number one reason is, I believe, that Israel is the Jew among nations. It is indeed a Jewish state, and I believe that much of that anti-Israeli feeling is actually latent anti-Semitism.
No question.
But it is much easier, it is much more bon ton, it is much more politically correct to be anti-Israel than to be anti-Semitic. So a lot of that latent anti-Semitism has transformed into anti-Israelism, especially in Europe. The other thing is that Israel, for some obscure reason, has always been the canary in the coal mine. It has been, I mean, is that an expression that is used in this country?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
My wife is English, and when I used it one day on television, I came home and she said, well, what's the canary in the coal mine? So it's probably an American expression rather than a British expression. But as you know, coal miners used to take canaries down because they're the most sensitive to any sign of danger. Israel is the canary in the coal mine. Israel has always been the canary on the coal mine, not only because it is a villa in the jungle, and truly a villa in the midst of a very tough, cruel, cynical, and brutal neighborhood, but because it has always been there to alert the world against dangers. If you take Iran, for example, Iran is not an Israeli problem. The Iranian issue is not an Israeli issue. The conflict is not an Iranian-Israeli conflict or Muslim-Jewish conflict. Iran is a danger to civilization as we know it, and it is an existential danger. And it is an existential danger to the world. We saw what nearly happened in Washington, D.C. when they tried to assassinate the Saudi ambassador. But somehow, the world looks at Israel and then says, Iran is an Israeli problem. And if Israel ever does anything, you know, this whole thing could blow up. This could end up in a, you know, in a third world war. And somehow Israel is there, indeed, as the sign of danger, as the sign of sanity in a crazy, crazy world. By the way, I don't know how relevant that is, but I remember when I was at the UN and I tried to explain, especially to my colleagues at the UN, what a crazy world we live in. And remember, that was like 4 years ago, so some of those descriptions may not be so apt today. I told them that you know you live in a crazy world when the world's greatest rapper is white, the world's greatest golfer is black, the world's greatest soldiers are Jewish, Germany does not want to go to war, and the French accuse the Americans of being arrogant. That's how you know you live in a crazy world. Now, believe me, nowhere is that world crazier than on that citadel of hypocrisy and double standards on the East River. But at the end of the day, I promise you one thing. Israel will prevail, and it will prevail. It will prevail not only because it is strong and it is moral and it is just, but at the end of the day, a country that has given the world the Israel Philharmonic and the Weizmann Institute and the Hebrew University, and has friends like Ed Koch and Dan Senor, can do no less. Thank you.
You did good.
Mayor Koch, to pick up with one of the points that Ambassador Gillerman was bringing up about the latent anti-Semitism, do we run the risk by presenting this notion of Israeli exceptionalism, about Israel's incredible achievements, of exacerbating anti-Semitism, of playing into it? Say, here you go, you know, now it's no longer just the Jews, it's this tough little country. And also, I want to add another question. Do you think that perhaps the dislike or the hatred of Israel is simply an easy target instead of being anti-American? That somehow we're dealing with the big Satan and the little Satan, and it's easier to pick on the enemies of Israel are really just reflecting anti-Americanism?
I believe, and have had that belief for many, many years, that attacks upon Israel are simply a way to express your anti-Semitic feelings and say you're not anti-Semitic, you're attacking an independent nation. And the response to that is very simple. Of course you can criticize the state of Israel. I have. They're not perfect. But the fact is, if you criticize them for actions taken by a state that you would not criticize another state for taking, that's anti-Semitism. And it is rampant throughout the world. And one of the reasons I think that the United States ultimately knows that it can count on Israel when it can't count on so many of its other allies. You think we can count on the French? They can't count on themselves. The fact is that when you have countries like Britain abstaining at the UNESCO vote instead of standing with the United States, you realize how cowardly they are. In that particular case, France voted to support the entry of the Palestinian Authority. You can't count on these people, but we know we can count on Israel. Just think of what would have happened if Israel had not taken out the Iraqi nuclear facility in 1981. How many American soldiers and the soldiers of so many other nations would have died as a result of the Iraqi having a nuclear weapon, which they were deprived of? Or take a more current situation when the Israeli took out the Syrian reactor. The fact is
According to foreign sources. That's correct.
Right. Listen, from me you get credit. The fact is they took it out, and the nations of the world, normally willing and wanting desperately to attack Israel, but knowing how important it was that that be done, didn't attack Israel for one of the first times in the history of the United Nations. Just imagine if Bashar Assad had a nuclear weapon today, what he would be doing with it against his own people. And then I think so often about who are our greatest problems? Other Jews. When I think of that elderly woman, and she said she was 81, and she's going to be on the flotilla to break the Gaza blockade because she feels so strongly about how the Palestinians are being persecuted. I have said, why doesn't she go to Syria? Why doesn't she take a look there? If she's so conscious of the need to stand up and protect other peoples, and particularly in the Arab world. Our greatest enemies, and they have a right to their opinion, even though I want to smash them, are our own nuts. When you have that woman who broke up the Philharmonic, the Israeli Philharmonic in London, she's Jewish. From her name, she must be Jewish, and right. I wanted to say to myself, I did say to myself, I'd like to throttle you. Because what you should know is that when they came for the Jews, or when they will come for the Jews in a particular land, and you're there, you will not be exempted. I said, and I was reminded tonight by our moderator, Rabbi Lau, once chief rabbi, a good friend of mine, brother of Natali Levi, who I came to really love and adore when he was consul general. He came to see me, Rabbi Lau, when I was mayor, and he, as he came up the stairs of Gracie Mansion in the backyard, I went over and I said to him, Rabbi, I'm also a survivor. He looked at me. He said, Mayor, you were born in New York. You're not a survivor. How can you be a survivor? I said, all of the Jews of the world were targeted by Adolf Hitler and all of his subordinates and supporters. And had they had the ability to win the war, which thank God they did not, and had they come here, or even made peace with us, not even coming here, you don't think the Jews would have been picked up? And I would have been one of them. I am a survivor, and so are you in the audience. And that is what I seek to convey to the people who say to me, why are you so upset? I mean, I write commentaries. I write a commentary every week. I enjoy writing. So maybe 1 out of 10, I went back and I counted them just to see it. And 1 out of 10 relates to Israel. But I have people, primarily Jews, who say, why are you constantly writing about us? Like if I don't write, nobody will know they're Jewish, you know. Right. But the fact is, we have to stand up. We are a small people. We're all together 13 million people in the whole world. And we have got to stand up for our rights. We stand up and have stood up for everybody else's rights throughout the years. We have marched for everybody except for ourselves. And that is what I hate more than anything else, is the feeling that if you're Jewish, somehow or other you can separate yourself and stand apart. You can't, because your neighbors know who you are and you should be proud of it.
Wow. all I can say in Hebrew to that piece of work is Ad 120, until 120. Continue on with that strength and that passion. It's incredible.
Thank you.
I want to bring it back to the American-Israel relationship, and in particular back to the topic of startup nation. And one of the things which was interesting today at the Wall Street seminar was that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce announced a new initiative, which is about Israel creating U.S. jobs, which, again, to the ear of the person who hasn't really followed this, sounds strange. Israel creating U.S. jobs, but the reality is that right now there is a food fight going on among cities in this country trying to attract startups from Israel. There were 27 people from South Carolina, last week, trekking to Israel to go bring businesses to South Carolina. Huge towns like Evansville, Indiana, has sent the city fathers to go look for startups. Is it possible that Israel can help America get its innovation mojo back?
Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we first of all, in educating American businesses about the opportunities, and they know many of them, is to remind, we have to stop talking, our community has to stop talking about Israel as though it's a conflict. Israel is not a conflict. It is a country. And so much of our rhetoric is embedded in this notion of Israel as a conflict. Even when we talk to business people about job creation and economic issues, it's that old line before the Jewish holidays, right? Every Jewish holiday can be summed up as, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And what we need, as my co-author Saul said, we need to completely change the way we talk about Israel. It should be, they tried to kill us, we won, let's innovate. And that has got to be our message, that we are going to change the world. Now, what does changing the world mean? A couple of anecdotes. One, I was in Israel in August with a group of congressmen on a kind of trip that AIFL does quite effectively. And one congressman, we were spending day in, day out doing all this conflict stuff about the Iranian threat, about the Katyusha rocket threat from Gaza, but all very important stuff. We're driving on the highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and he sees a sign for Teva. And he says, that's where I want to go. Can I visit Teva? I said, why do you want to visit Teva? This is a guy who represents a congressional district in Southern Virginia. He goes, because they employ 500 of my constituents. And you start talking to these guys, one member after the other, and they have districts that are populated by Israeli companies that are setting up shop in their districts, creating jobs, point one. Point two, in New York City, John, you say cities are competing? In New York City right now, there is an initiative, an RFP, to set up a tech university here. And the Technion is one of the top competitors for this, partnering with Cornell to set up a huge campus here. By the way, everyone in this room should contact Mayor Bloomberg, contact the City Council, and strongly encourage them to select the Cornell Technion partnership. But when people hear that Technion could establish a foothold right here in New York City, they're like salivating. So the answer is yes. American companies are educated about this. There needs to be more education, and we are really on the front lines of that education campaign.
Israel is judged to a different standard than all the countries in the world, and especially the countries in the region. People around us and countries around the world can get away with murder. When we do something to defend ourselves, we're judged more harshly and more severely than any other country in the world. We, each and every day, are defending our homes, and we are also defending democracy. We are on the front line for the fight of democracy without asking one single American soldier to endanger his life for us. Not a single drop of American blood. And I think that, especially in this country, but also around the world, should be part of the testimony and testament of Israel.
Dan, a final comment?
Yeah. Some of you may be familiar with a company called Akamai, one of the great technology success stories out of MIT. Daniel Lewin is Israeli. His family moved to the United States. He grew up, he lived here until he was 13 years old. Then his father wanted to get the family back to Israel, so he resisted it, but he moved with his family back to Israel, ultimately served in the IDF, served in one of the elite units in Sayeret Maktal, one of the special forces units. When he finished the Army, he started a company in the United States called Akamai at MIT. You know, I mean, these great stories. You know, he goes to pitch Yahoo to sell their services to Yahoo. He thought he was pitching them on just a test, a pilot program, and they said, absolutely, we like it. We want you to start right away. He says, all right, which section of like the sports page did you have in mind? He says, no. Yahoo said, we want to put you on the home page tomorrow. And without missing a beat in a classic Israeli way, he said, all right, we'll get it done. Thinking inside, how the hell are we going to get this done? And sure enough, they got it done. And it became this incredible success story. Now, Daniel Lewin was on the first flight that hit the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001. If you go look at the manifest from that flight, they were able to piece together that he was sitting one row in front of or one row behind, I can't remember which, but one row away from Mohammed Atta. There were two passengers that were believed whose throats were slit on that flight before the plane made impact, and before actually the terrorists really conducted the operation to take over the plane. And many believe, and there's been a lot of investigative work on this, that the two people whose throats were slit were people who resisted, who actually tried to orchestrate some kind of resistance to the successful execution of the plane crashing into the World Trade Center. And this past weekend over Thanksgiving, I spent time with a friend of my wife's who's from the South, and he took a job at MIT, ultimately worked at Akamai. I knew Daniel Lewin was one of his first employees. He said the biggest challenge for their company today is they want to keep that Lewin culture in the company, this amazing Israeli culture in this company today that's really disconnected to Israel. I mean, he launched it, and it's like on its way, making its way in the world. And in the Daniel Lewin story, you have this whole interwovenness of the American and the Israeli experience, right? In every way. Guy lives here for 13 years, goes back to Israel, serves in the Israeli military, is trained in the Israeli military, uses that know-how to start a company and becomes this great entrepreneur and leader and starts this company that makes a huge imprint on America and creates all these jobs in America. And then how tragic it was that he was killed on the biggest terrorist attack that hit America, not Israel. Yet he's from a country that suffered more terrorist attacks per capita than any country in the world. And yet he was killed because he was resisting the terrorists and he was using training that he got in the IDF. This is an interwovenness between these two countries. And every American, young American on campuses, to come back to your question, John, Jew and non-Jew, need to understand the interwovenness of these American and Israeli experiences, common values, common enemies, and common experiences.
Thank you, Dan, Ambassador Gillerman, Mayor Koch, for a great panel. Thank you very much.
Okay.